Welcome to the latest episode of the Construction Insiders podcast, where our host, Jessica Bush, talks with industry experts about new trends, best practices, and how to successfully deliver construction projects in today's market. Whatever your role on a project, we think you'll find these discussions interesting and worth your time.
All right, thank you, Jason. So for today's episode, we are going to switch gears from talking about themed entertainment, and we are going to talk about sustainability and the intersection of construction and how we move forward in today's market with today's expectations, how that all fits. And we couldn't think of anyone better to bring in than our very own Christine Marez to talk about this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Christine, to the show. And we're really excited to have you here and talk about all things sustainability. So welcome.
Thank you, Jess. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so just without wasting any time, I always just like to jump in because we have a limited amount of time with you. So when you look at sustainability and you look at construction and design in today's environment, today's world, what does that look like? And I'm sure it's changed dramatically over the last couple of years, last decade, but what are you seeing now?
Well, that's a great question. And since we're starting a new decade, I think it's important to look at the past 10 years, specifically at the built industry and how it's evolved. What I've seen has the incorporation of sustainability elements into the design and construction process. Of course, we're all familiar with the green certification of LEED for LEED buildings. And that certainly was a driver 10 years ago and 20 years ago and is today. The other big shift that we've seen in the industry is the increase in regulatory requirements, usually in states and then in large metropolitan cities. It has really changed the built environment for new construction, for renovations, for large buildings, campuses. States have taken upon increased energy codes, and that certainly has impact how designers design buildings and how we operate them today. And then I guess the other thing is really a recognition that sustainability now is not a one-off type value-added process, but really it is, the result of it is lower cost savings for the owners, able to operate our buildings more efficiently. The building and construction environment and the whole process accounts for about 36% of the global energy use worldwide. So we're using a lot of power. And also, as we relate it to climate change, 39% of all carbon emissions come from buildings. So it's really important.
From the actual construction process.
Both from the construction and the building, the operation of the building itself. It emits that much greenhouse gas emissions into the air through the whole process of the building operation.
And that's a significant number that I've never heard. And that seems, when you see it, that black and white, that's a very large percentage.
Absolutely. Just think if we actually got all of our buildings to be energy efficient or reduced our reliability on fossil fuels, that's almost 40% of the emissions that we could impact worldwide.
Wow. Okay. And not to go back too far, but you were talking about the regulatory aspect of all of this and states. Is it also cities that are jumping in this as well, or is it state driven most times, or do you see a big difference?
It has started with, I would say 20 years ago, with the kind of first climate report is when states really got on board with their commitment to reducing state emissions. And largely this was directed at transportation, vehicle use, really trying to understand how greenhouse gas emissions were impacting how we function, how our society functions. And then certainly with the passing of the Paris Accords, we've seen a huge shift in climate change awareness and education that has now gotten to companies starting to take responsibility for their part in what they build in their build portfolio, how they operate, and also how they are looking forward to the next generation in who they hire and how they hire and all of their policies. So they're not only looking at it from the standpoint of where the state started regulatory requirements, but it trickled down to the cities, and then it now trickles down to large agencies. And they tend to roll up to try to meet the goals of the highest entity, which is usually the states.
I see. Okay, interesting. And so today, what are some of these things that you're seeing that are being incorporated into the building's design or operation? And how has that changed recently?
Sure. I would say that I mentioned LEED earlier. There's a number of green certifications. I think LEED is the most well-known. In fact, when people think about sustainability,
That's what you think.
That's what you think.
Yeah.
And that's great because it's a great starting place. We want people to have their buildings be LEED, but we also want them to not do LEED for LEED. And the new consumers in the next generation are pretty savvy about this. But we can talk about that in a minute. There's also other certifications. BREEAM is a certification that used more globally, and we're seeing that a lot in the UK and in Europe, and it's very similar to LEED as well. The other area that is really come to fruition in the last 5 to 10 years is building commissioning. Whereas back in the day, building commissioning or commissioning of a building was simply, let's just test the systems to see if they work. It was a test and startup process. It wasn't really regulated. And then the operation and performance of the building became much more critical as energy costs increase and water costs increase through the years. And we realized that by commissioning a building, you are really making sure that it's operating as it was designed. And owners now have come to recognize that their capital investment in their projects or development or their facilities is only going to be realized if they have someone making sure that the building is performing as it was intended. And so now we're seeing more regulatory requirements for building commissioning, and really it's for the advantage of the building operators that they are able to then maintain their buildings for much less cost because of the commissioning process.
So these commissionings that you're talking about, these like kind of monthly, quarterly, just checking up on the building, making sure that everything is as it should be.
Yes, and where commissioning used to start at the tail end of the building, it was like the last thing on the checklist before you open the building.
Box check.
Now commissioning starts in the design phase. The commissioning agent actually works very closely with the designers to make sure that the specifications are correct and to make sure that throughout the building as they're installing it correctly. So it's a much better oversight.
Well, now it seems like the knowledge is there, and the knowledge of how important it is there.
Absolutely, and it really goes to create more of an integrated team between the designer and the constructor and the owner as we move through the process.
Interesting. Okay. Well, it all sounds good. And so speaking of all things good, what shifts have you seen? I'm assuming there's been major shifts in sustainability and how it impacts design and construction. Do you kind of have like a top 3 that you've seen? What are you seeing on the ground level here?
I think what I've seen, and primarily over the last couple of years, is one is an increased level of corporate responsibility. And what does that mean? You've heard of probably various definitions of corporate social responsibility. Sustainability has really had an increased awareness to the point where corporations are now looking at their own responsibility. Basically, they're walking the talk. Anything from setting a goal to build for net zero or build a carbon neutral facility or simply just reducing our carbon footprint. They are also looking at the other side of sustainability, which is kind of the social justice. Are their labor policies fair? Are they giving back to the community? How do they operate themselves? They may build a sustainable building, but are they using recycled paper? Are they creating an environment within their employees that they are operating sustainably too? This will come into play as we talk about what's the future of sustainability. The other shift I see is really addressing the needs of the next gen consumer. They are predicted to be the new workforce. And as you know, a lot of our younger generation are really teaching us older people what sustainability really means and how it's their job to be responsible for it.
So do you see companies actually listening to that feedback now versus just saying, sure, but like they're actually now cutting out the water bottles in the fridge and they're actually working towards net zero? You really do see a shift towards listening to that next generation.
I absolutely see a shift. I have 2 daughters myself, and over the last 10 years, they have corrected me and really had my own thought process change because of what they're learning in school, what they're learning in college, how they're out there on the front lines being activists and really taking on climate change because climate change is here around them. They're
Right.
seeing
They're
it with
seeing
the
it
fires.
daily.
They're seeing it with global devastation, with, storm surges and hurricanes. I mean, it's their way of responding and being responsible for their part.
So, talking about the next generation and how they're influencing sustainability, where do you see that going?
I think we have to put it in perspective. I mean, as you know, we live at a time where every Friday, 1.4 million kids are in 125 companies are leaving their classroom in protest for climate change.
That's a big deal.
It's a big
It's
deal.
a lot of people.
These are not like somewhere, sometime. These are our kids that in another 5 or 10 years are going to have jobs, are going to be part of the marketplace, are going to be the biggest consumers, are going to attend sporting events where they don't expect to see waste. There is going to be a demand now. And I think the shift is going to be that this is going to become the new normal for a way of life. And we as planners and builders and designers have to prepare for that. We have to make sure that we are now thinking ahead of figuring out what they're going to want before they do.
Right. And it's become not just one person climbing into a tree protesting, it's millions. And that's significant. And that demands change. And clearly you've been seeing the change on the build side.
Yes.
And so with this kind of new normal and the next generation, what market sectors are really being affected by this? Is it across the board, or do you see pockets that are really being affected?
I think the most surprising to me, and I guess in even just the last 24 months, has been, as an example, in the financial markets. And a lot of where we look for trends in the market tend to come from the money and how it's being spent and how it's being created and how it's being invested.
A huge driver.
Huge driver, right?
Yeah.
And one of our clients is we have many financial investment provider clients have created in a whole new next generation portfolio level for investors, because what has happened is our next generation investors are hugely cognizant of their responsibility, and they want their dollars to go to something that contributes to global climate change. Mm-hmm. So what has happened is this financial market has shifted, and now they're adopting not only building standards for their own portfolio and operations, they're adopting huge climate emission goals for what they invest in, for what can be invested in the market. Climate change and climate action is going to be one of the biggest job creation drivers in the world over the next 10, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I think the financial sector is the first to recognize that, because they're seeing it now. They're seeing it in what's being invested today.
When I was say, when your money is being invested, you're seeing the returns. You're not seeing the returns. You're going to make changes based on that.
Absolutely. And you'll notice there's commercials out now. I won't name any specific companies, but you'll notice they're catering to the next generation already.
Right. Interesting. And so when we talk about sustainability, climate change, I kind of always put that in one hand and I put design and construction in the other. So how are you connecting these two different worlds, and what does that look like?
I think initially, and sustainability was always looked at as conservation. It was something good if you could do it, but it wasn't integral. It was just, if you wanted to do something good, politically correct, you did something sustainable. That is no longer the case. Sustainability, and we'll call it climate change, and how you are resilient to climate change now go hand in hand.
Okay.
We are at a point where the new normal for our society is global fires, droughts, rising sea levels. We have, especially in the last 12 months, and obviously California and Australia, to make it relevant to specifically today,
right.
There's just huge changes in the environment, and it has affected our built environment to some really kind of remarkable new technology and some really intriguing and amazing responses to some of the most devastating disasters that we've seen in the last 12 months.
And it's unfortunate that these disasters have happened, but you would just hope that at least they can be lessons learned. People can move on from this, rebuild, figure out a better way. And so, you've worked on a ton of projects across the country, internationally. What are some of these examples that you've seen, whether they're states or they're private, companies, cities? What have you seen that has really kind of stood out in your mind?
A couple of things really stood out that recently in New York City, who was, as you know, hugely impacted and continues to be impacted by first Hurricane Sandy and then the recent flooding. And it's a unique environment because it is home to millions of people in a very small footprint. And what has happened, though, is the actual building projects for critical facilities like hospitals that are literally on the edge of the East River. Now in the design, it's being incorporated to have like automatic floodgates come up when there's a storm surge, to be able to build the building so that the backup generation is now in a place where you can get to it. Where in Sandy, everything was underwater and they learned so many lessons. They're building like huge retaining walls around hospitals and critical facilities. So these are the kind of things, and it's not just New York, it's Miami, it's a number of locations that have been impacted by storm surge and rising seawaters, that you're going to continue to see this.
The positive lessons learned from tragedy.
Absolutely. And as an engineer, it's exciting to see this kind of technology, and designers and architects are really getting on board to solve these problems.
Well, and the creativity that goes into, protecting these buildings, building them with that built-in protection. I feel like that's a lot of times lost, that just the architects, the design people all coming together to figure out this problem and really solve it.
Absolutely. And it's taken an integrated team. That's another shift, is really architects not just designing on their own. They need the engineers. They need the mechanical and energy engineers now as part of the team from the beginning to be able to solve some of these problems.
And so, there's the build side of things, but there's also some, I'm assuming, massive planning that goes in before, or if you already have current facilities, a current campus. What have you seen on that side? Is there any examples that really stand out? I know we do a lot of work with, different school districts and things like that across the country.
I think right here at home, we were involved in a project with Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District last year, putting together their really strategy for sustainability and climate resiliency. During the process of this, as we were holding town hall meetings with the residents of Malibu and Santa Monica, we were hit with the Malibu fire. And in the process of us coming up with goals, people on our committee had their homes burned, and students didn't have a place to go home to. And so it really caused us to look at how we can build into kind of long-term planning for campuses and schools and how they build, to look at these surrounding areas, to look at some of these threats, to increase how they communicate even during the threats, and how they plan for water. During the Thomas Fire in Ventura, one of the lessons learned was that the hydrants dried up. They couldn't actually put out the fire for the residents because there was no backup plan for that.
So now you're saying not only is the communications plan nailed down, there's also water plans. What do those look like? I mean, how does that even change? I mean, are you working then with the local water districts and the fire departments? Is that now part of when you talk about a team coming together, are they now incorporated in
Absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing is now service offerings for, consultants to go in and help cities work with their regional water districts, work with the regional utilities to create these partnerships and alliances. So it's not just the city itself and the residents, it's really the entire region coming together, well, along with the transportation agency, because it takes all of them to be able to, when there's a disaster, there's a disaster. And it doesn't matter if you work for the city or the county, everyone comes together.
Everyone's trying to figure it out.
Exactly. And that's great, because that's how some of these climate action plans are being developed.
Interesting. And so, what are some of the misconceptions about sustainability? I know that, there has to be a lot of false claims, statements, just misunderstandings. One little thing isn't going to make a big difference type of mentality. What are some of these misconceptions you're seeing that you're fighting kind of against?
Sure. Absolutely. And I do still see it. It's great to live in a big city where people are more progressive, but we have to be able to reach everybody. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people think nobody knows what sustainability means. That is not true any longer. And it's pretty evident by our children, the next generation, by our corporations, by our financial markets, who are now making decisions about investments for capital, for increasing their portfolios, for how they operate, and they're learning very quickly. So that's a big misconception. Another one is, I think we've always thought of sustainability as a luxury item, something that, well, it'd be great if we had more money to do, but maybe we'll think about it in the future. There's been numerous case studies that now tie sustainability to the function of the building, to the performance of the building, and most importantly, to for owners and developers how it's going to completely decrease your costs in the long run, your kind of life cycle payback of the building when you start thinking about how you're operating it.
But what's interesting about that comment to me is that when we talk about sustainability being a luxury item, and you think about, what that upfront cost is going to be of my electric car, or what's an upfront cost of making my building net zero. And so getting past that mindset of the short term and getting into the long-term mindset, I think is what just as people we struggle with, right? So
absolutely.
So that you can see in the design construction, what's my short-term cost going to be? Well, is it really worth it down the line if I'm just going to sell this building off or what have you?
Absolutely. It's interesting. There was a recent Dodge report that came out, and it actually had researched and found that they're saying now that building owners, that the building itself, if it's built green, is actually seeing a 10% increase in the actual asset value of the building itself.
So even if they were to resell
absolutely.
It, just dump it off the portfolio,
right.
There's still a value
absolutely.
in doing it from the very beginning.
Yeah, it's just making economic sense now.
Interesting. Well, that's a good shift then.
Yes, I think that's too the misconception that sustainability is too expensive. It's, there's a number of case studies, like I mentioned before, where people have saved so much. Solar, as an example, 20 years ago, solar was just like this hugely innovative thing that nobody could afford. And now, and even with the changes that have gone through in the United States and with, importing solar panels, and, we haven't really seen a shift in the market. Solar still has a return on investment of 5 years or less.
Interesting. And still that upfront cost is such a scary thing to some people because they're not thinking long term.
Right.
So that's really the shift that I've been hearing you say, is just really shifting towards that long term sustaining our world view
absolutely.
Versus the short term living in the moment.
Absolutely. Another really kind of interesting example of, you mentioned your electric vehicles. If we've had a recent shift in California with the utilities, and this is just one example where the utility companies became really savvy because they're actually seeing where energy is being generated, where it's being used. And because everybody's going home at night to plug in their cars, the shift in the usage of energy went to like after 4:00. And so the utilities, they made a big change, and they shifted the actual increase in time of use. I mean, that was a huge response to something that technology wasn't even around 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I got that letter in the mail. So I noticed that shift in time of use. And they're savvy. I mean, everyone,
that's right.
They figured out what was going on. And so when we're talking about kind of this shift, the long-term mindset with sustainability, what are things that owners can do now? Whether they have their building, whether they're thinking about a build, what would you suggest? Kind of what's their first steps?
I think the first thing is to get educated. And by that, I mean, make yourself aware, or hire someone who is going to represent your company, you as an owner, that understands sustainability, and give them an in-house responsibility. They will then guide the company to setting goals and seeing what's realistic and having a plan. Mm-hmm. Secondly, having a plan of where they see themselves in the next 5 or 10 years in response to their region, the global community around them. And part of that is going to be setting some kinds of emission reduction goals. It's got to be the foundation of your sustainable construction standards, and you have to have something that helps your day-to-day operations be more efficient and sustainable as well.
And so when you talk about, kind of setting those goals, standards, are there things that people that have existing buildings, are there your, top 3 go-to, do this day one kind of steps to get there, to start the process? Or does it really depend on the building itself?
I don't think there's a wrong place to start. I think a lot of building owners are kind of intimidated. They don't know where. We actually have a whole guide on how to start sustainability.
I mean, because it would be intimidating.
Yes.
For me, if I was an owner, to be like, all right, we're going to start doing this. Well, where do I even start? Is there an easy start?
Yeah. I mean, I think you just have to at least see what you're doing now. How much energy are you using? How much water you're using? One of the interesting shifts that I actually heard from one of our financial clients was they're changing the way that they're building, the people in their building live and breathe, and the environment they're creating. There's a couple certifications that don't have as much to do with the building, but have more to do with the way people live in the building. They're like the WELL certification or Fitwell are the most common two that are globally recognized.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're finding as they're recruiting the new talent to support the next workforce is that the next generation is asking questions like, what's the healthy building requirement? What's the air quality? How many breaks do I get? What's your, social equity, responsiveness?
Yeah.
Companies are really having to look a little bit differently at what they're providing people within their building as well.
And it's interesting you brought that up. And I love that you brought that up because I happen to sit across from a recruiting department here. And the questions that I hear from possible candidates for our own company, join our own firm, about the air quality. Well, I see you're next to the freeway on, when I pull you up on Google Maps, what does that mean for your air quality? Is there a gym? Is there, what is your lighting? Questions that when I first joined the company I never heard.
That's right.
And to see and hear that shift is really remarkable because people are asking and making decisions in a very tight talent market based on that.
And people want to live and breathe. They don't want to just go home and be sustainable and conserve and recycle. They want to be able, they know that this is something that they're going to be doing. They want that work-life balance too, and that same quality. And they're not willing and they're savvy enough to expect more.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, very big shift, and you see it across all elements of the business, construction, internal operations. It's all happening, and hopefully for those that aren't on board, will get on board because it's here.
Yes, and I'm learning every day too, along with everyone else.
Oh, it's like technology. How you stay on top of it is beyond me, but you're doing it.
Well, thank you. We have a great team.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to touch on? Or did I get enough questions out of you today? Or
I think this is a great starting point. I'd love to come back and we can talk about one aspect or something exciting that we're doing, but thank you so much for having me.
Well, no, of course, and it's been a pleasure, and I hope everyone learned a little bit, or at least got you thinking about what you could do. Right. So, thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Construction Insiders, we encourage you to check out our website at www.ccorpusa.com. That's ccorpusa.com, where you can find our full knowledge library under the Insights tab. It's all great stuff, we're really passionate about it, and we hope you'll check it out. Thanks for listening.